Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding and Utilizing Indexes. My name is Maggie Hastings, Education and Programming Coordinator at American Ancestors. I will be the moderator for today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is Senior Genealogist Melanie McComb. Melanie assists library visitors, both on-site and online, with their family history research. Melanie holds a BS from the State University of New York at Oswego. She is an international lecturer who teaches on a variety of topics, including colonial through 20th century American military research, genetic genealogy, Atlantic Canadian, African American, Jewish, and Irish genealogy. She is also an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. She has had articles published in American Ancestors Magazine and 50 Plus Advocate. She is also a blogger known as the Shamrock Genealogist. Indexes are an unparalleled tool for genealogists. Today's presentation will cover the history and formats of some of the more popular indexes for genealogists to use, as well as some tips for future searches. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen. We'll address those questions at the end. There is a syllabus available to be purchased in our store if you're interested. In addition, this presentation is being recorded for later viewing on our website and YouTube channel. So if you miss something on today's first listen, don't worry. You can always review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, I'll turn things over to Melanie.
Great. Thank you, Maggie, and good afternoon, everybody, wherever you're watching from. This topic is going to talk about how you can use indexes, and we're going to give you some background on how a lot of these were being created, some of the history, and then go through very specific formats because they can vary from record set to record set. So let's begin. So starting out with some background and history of exactly what indexes are, first we need to start with just some basics on what exactly is an index. So Merriam-Webster defines an index as being some type of list, which could include bibliographical information, so thinking about the actual sources being used, like when you're finding at the end of a book, or even citations to a body of literature, and arranged in some type of order. So whether it's alphabetical, by author, subject, or keyword. Now, for genealogists, indexes can vary, and they're not always what we think of as the index at the end of our book that we're looking into. They can take many forms and actually come a lot of times before the records that we're viewing. So indexes were largely created as a way to make work easier for those that actually had to retrieve copies of records. They largely were done for courthouse clerks and other government officials because people would often come in and need to see a copy of an existing deed or a will or some other record that needed to be pulled. Well, instead of going through every single record possible, even if it was chronological, it made sense to create some type of index so that you could easily go to the respective volume that you're interested in and be able to retrieve it much more easily for the customer that came in. Now, while indexes were being introduced, and we find that a lot of these general indexes that we're going to talk about, these were really introduced in the 19th century and later. And not only did the local courthouse clerks have indexes, but even the federal government required that indexes were done. This is actually a newspaper article that was talking about how there needs to be an alphabetical index of the acts and resolutions passed by Congress at the preceding session so that it could be compiled together. So if they ever needed to refer back to a law that was being passed, they could actually have an easier way of getting access to that data. and they were not always easily adopted. So indexing was very much a big industry that we find, especially when you get into the later 19th century, where many companies would approach many different clerks. And there were a lot of discussions in the newspapers that you find about how the indexes were being used, and even down to the specific ones, as there was a lot of concern about, is this indexing creating a lot more work, because it usually involved having to maybe start over a new index, and just talking about maybe what the cost was involved. So this was actually an article in the Baltimore Sun talking specifically about the Campbell index, which we're going to talk about a little bit later today. Now, indexes can come in many different formats, as I mentioned. So we're going to talk about some of the formats that you may see them in. The most common ones you might see are the actual handwritten index within an individual volume. It may usually comes in the beginning of the volume, sometimes it's at the end. However, indexes can also show up in different forms, such as an index card that was being done by different government repositories or state libraries, etc. Someone may even have published an index of records by actually going through the records manually on your behalf, or revisiting older ones and creating a much more user-friendly index that you can use and view at your local library. Some have even added these to online websites and added the images that you can see that. So oftentimes you might find that a lot of the indexes that we're talking about today are slowly starting to make their way online as well, where you can actually view those pages. This is an example of what one of these index cards might look like. This is specifically a card index for probate records in Connecticut. And as you can see at the bottom, it's deposited in the Connecticut State Library. So this record is showing that for the estate of Joshua Sears, he's of the town of Norwalk, and he's in the probate district of Fairfield. The year is 1754 of when his estate was being brought into court, with a case number 5501. We see that there are 2 documents, a will and codicil, and an inventory. So this actually gives some information on exactly how you can find the case file number, because of how it's being arranged, in this case, alphabetically by the name of the person of the estate. A lot of times you're going to find in county record books and other sets, especially even town records, are these handwritten indexes. So this is an example of a county record book that shows the list of the administrators and guardians on the left-hand side. And you'll notice that they are all with the surname starting with an H. And then on the right-hand side is the corresponding ones for the intestates, so the actual name of the deceased. So you'll notice a lot of similar names, such as an Isaac Heath the second is actually the administrator for an Abraham Heath. So there's some relationship there, most likely. And then you see the corresponding page numbers. And besides the intestates on the right-hand side, you also see the names of minors, because on the left-hand side, you have guardianships. Guardianships were set up for minor children, for probate inheritances, so they also are going to be indexed under the name of the guardian, and then the right-hand side actually might give them their names. A bulk of this presentation is going to talk about the different indexing systems that exist today, and we're going to largely focus on those that are used in the United States. The most common one you might see as you're looking at different types of records are what we call alphabetical indexes. So it's similar to what we saw with that county record book index, where they all started with the first letter of the surname, H. Now, it only really starts alphabetical in terms of the first letter. Sometimes they go through the indexes and put them in fully alphabetical order, which are always really nice to find. but a lot of times they don't, and they're going to be arranged chronologically as the records are coming in to the clerks to add them into the book. So a lot of times you're going to get that it's just the first letter of the surname, and then you need to really pay close attention to the list to see where the name might show up. And keeping in mind that as you go further through the list, that it might be based on the years getting later, which might help you narrow it on where you should find the names. So a common place we might find an alphabetical index might be records like naturalization records. In this case, this is an alphabetical index for the declarations of intentions that were filed in the U.S. District Court in the Southern District of New York. And this is on Family Search. And it notes here that it even says that it's an alphabetical index. So it's really good when you're looking at different records on different websites if they explicitly name the type of index. So when we go through this type of alphabetical index, this is one of our more favorite ones because in this case, they actually have index by last name, comma, first name, and they actually are in complete order. So there might be maybe a couple slight errors in there, but for the most part, it is in complete alphabetical order. So you would just need to find the range of names that you are interested in and then go into the camera that corresponds with them. In this case, we're going to look at surnames within Aslanoff Alexander to Benson William. And here are examples of what some of these records look like. So we have an Israel Beckenstein is going to come before Abraham Becker. And the information on the card is basically corresponding to the information on how you can actually obtain a copy of the naturalization file. There usually is some kind of docket or case file number or other reference that you can see. But in this case, we see that it is in fully alphabetical order, which is the ideal. Now, other types of indexes that exist, especially that take a lot of different indexing types, include deed indexes. So you're going to see a lot of deeds in today's presentation. And probates. So with deed indexes, we might find that there are separate indexes based on the person that is selling or the grantor, or by the grantee, the buyer. And sometimes they give different names. So for grantors or sellers, they might be called forward indexes or direct. And for grantees or the buyers, they're called reverse or indirect. Now, sometimes in some states and counties, there may be cases where the grantor and the grantee are not in separate volumes and actually are in the same volume. And maybe it's half the book is one side and half is the other, or every other page goes back and forth between grantor and grantee, and then the alphabet. So let's give an example of what a grantor or a direct index might look like. This is for Middlesex County, Massachusetts. So we can see the date that it was actually of reception. So when the date was being recorded, knowing that this could be recorded many, many years after the actual date on the actual deed. So keep in mind that even if the date looks a little late, you still want to review the record. Then you have the grantor or the seller, and then you have the grantee in the third column, so who's actually buying. Then you have the volume and page number, and you might find it under the volume is either volume, book, Liber, something like that. And then you have page. Sometimes page might show up as folio. It's another term. And then in this case, this county actually lists out the city or town that the deed is for and a property description, which is not always in every deed, but at least an index, but at least gives you an idea of some of the detail that is available. So similarly, now if we look at the grantee, now we can look, and it's very similar. We're just kind of reverse the second and third columns where, again, you have your recording date, and then you have your buyer, and then you have your seller. And the reason why I point this out is sometimes it's easier to maybe start with when someone is selling property so that you can back up into when you find the individual purchases later on in the grantee indexes. But in some cases, you might find it's easier to start with when did they first purchase and then follow the path along if you don't have any information later, for example. Another indexing system that is built into a lot of our online genealogy websites, like American Ancestors and Ancestry, is known as Soundex. This is a phonetic index in which names that sound alike but are spelled differently are still going to show up in your search results when you're searching online and also are indexed together. Soundex was actually used to index records like the federal census. There is an example of this federal census, such as using mirror code. That's a more specific type of phonetic soundex that's used. And also Soundex you can find being used in things like vital records, passengership records, naturalizations as well. So many times you might come across a naturalization index card like this here, where at the top left corner there is a strange code. So it's going to start with a letter and then it's going to be a 3-digit number string. That's actually the Soundex code, and we're going to show you how to put this together. But this is based on the last name of Barnett. And his first name is William Reynolds, and we see that he has naturalized at the U.S. District Court in Boston, Massachusetts in 1796. So this was a project that was actually done through like the Work Progress Administration during the 30s to actually create these index cards and go through this for places like New England and other areas of the United States. And as I mentioned, Soundex is built into your genealogical databases. So you don't have to necessarily calculate out the code, but we'll show you how to do that shortly. But a lot of times you might find that it is just a check mark option when you're going to search. This is the database search screen for American Ancestors, and you see that there is actually an option to check off Soundex. So when you search a name, it's looking for other names that fall within that same Soundex code. And similarly, on Ancestry, when you start to enter a last name first, that's when you can then open up where it says exact, and that gives you different filtering options where you can actually check off Soundex in addition to something like similar or sounds like, which are more different types of fuzzy searches. So the Soundex system is based on actually assigning different numerical values. So you basically start off with the first letter of the surname, and then the rest of the letters are then assigned different numbers. And this is in your handout, by the way, so don't feel like you have to race to write this down. And you'll notice that different letters, they're mostly focused on the consonants. And that is because the vowels, A, E, I, O, and U, and also the letters Y, W, and H are actually ignored as part of that Soundex code. So the Soundex code is going to consist of that first letter of the surname, and then you're going to start to assign those numbers based on the next 3 consonants that have a numerical number assigned. And then any other letters, you just disregard them. And one thing to keep in mind is that sometimes when you run into double lettering, is you don't necessarily double it up. So if you have, for example, the letter T twice in a row, like maybe the last name Pretty, you would not put down 33, you would just put 3 for that number. And then if you have a very short name, you just start using zeros instead. So let's show an example of how we can actually convert the names Stewart, S-T-E-W-A-R-T, and S-T-U-A-R-T. So as we noted, both of them start with the letter S, and they both sound alike. We then go to the next letter. So the next letter is a T, we give that a value of 3. We're then going to skip different letters. So for Stewart, we're going to skip EWA. And then for Stewart on the right, we're going to skip the U and the A. They both have an R, so they get a 6, and then they have a T at the end, they get a 3. And when you do this calculation for each, they both have the same Soundex code. So that is why when you do a search using Stewart, STEWART, or STUART, why both of them come up in the search results if you check off Soundex, because they have the same code. Now, there are different versions of Soundex codes that we might find in more specific locations. For example, when you're looking at New Hampshire for vital records prior to 1900, they have a version of Soundex where they alphabetize by the first and third letter of the surname and ignore the second letter, which a lot of times, might be a vowel. It's not always though. And then you have these different ranges, which you can see on the right-hand side, how you can find names within the K and Ls. And these indexes apply specifically to births, deaths, and a bride's index. There actually is a separate groom's index, but it doesn't fall within the same alphabetization that we find. The next type of index we'll talk about is what's known as a Liber index, or it's based on separate volumes. And this is where the clerks would just take the first letter of the surname in any of those names, and they would just put it into one volume. So this volume would be the A volume, this would be the B volume, this would be the C volume. And that was just an easier way to put them together without having to go through a more complicated system. So you typically might find these in a lot of courthouses, maybe when they haven't adopted a more sophisticated system based on just their availability and staff. So sometimes you can even find that these Liber indexes are used for vital records as well. So this is actually out of Davidson County, North Carolina, where we can see that these are surnames that all start with an A. And they are not in fully complete order. And then you see that it starts with the book. So we start with book and there's 1, and then it's 1-1, 1-2. So they may start creating separate versions of that book 1, and then they move on to book 2. And you'll notice that as they're going through the records, we start off with book 1, book 1, 2 are all in looks like 1914, but then when you get to like 1915, that's when we start getting into volume 2. So then they start creating subsequent volumes based on the years as well. Another type of index that you might come across is a vowel index. This is an index especially I've found a lot in like land deeds, especially like in places like Pennsylvania. And the way this works is that you take the first letter of a surname and you combine it with the first vowel of that surname. So in this example, if we took the surnames Campbell, Chandler, and Craig, all of these are going to be grouped together under CA, because C is the first letter and then A is the first vowel in each of those 3 names. So here's an example of a vowel index being used in a different type of record set. This was actually letters that were sent by the Confederate Secretary of War during the time of the Confederacy in the United States. And we see that the first left-hand column is for names that have a grouping of AA. So start with first letter of the surname is A, and then the next vowel is then A. And then on the right-hand side, we have the next grouping, which is then AE. Which, so again, first letter of the surname, and then the first vowel is E. And then their corresponding page numbers. The next type of record index that we might find, and we're starting to get into more specific companies now, is known as the Burr Record Index. This was actually a company based out of Hartford, Connecticut, founded in 1883. And they have taken a different form of taking those subgroups that we see. And instead of just doing 2 vowels, for example, they usually do 3 letters. So you would start off with the first letter of the surname, and then you would get into the next few letters that would correspond to the different ranges of surnames. So if we take the letter J down at the bottom here, we have JAA to JAC, and then we may have it pick up later to JAE to JAL, JAM to JAAP, etc. And they might skip a range, for example, JAD, if there are no names that fall within that record set. So here's an example of what the Burr record index might look like in practice. And this is out of Talbot County, Maryland. And this is an index to administration accounts. So thinking about, again, probate records. So we see that the tabs on the at the top show that we start in the letter B's, and then we get into different groupings. So for example, we have the BAL to BQ. So any names that fall within that range alphabetically would then be included in there. So you're going to have names like Banks and Banning and Bannon, etc. as part of that. Next type of index is the Campbell index, which we alluded to earlier. Now with the Campbell index, you take the first letter of the first name along with the first letter of the surname, and they're grouped together. So for example, we want to put all of the last names that start with C and all the first names that start with A, and that is really maybe one of your first groupings within the letter C. So that's going to be Adam Clyde, Alice Crowther, Andrew Cerny. Now, when you want to go on to the next grouping, let's say you go into the B's, then you could have something like Brian Cook or Benjamin Crothers, for example, and that would all fit into the next grouping. So with these types of records, the Campbell index sometimes can be a little tricky. So what is involved is these guide sheets that are involved. So we start off with the first letter. So in this case, J. And then we go to the first letter of the first name. So in this case, we're looking at A, which is on page 158. And then we see here are all the surnames that start with J, and then all the first names that start with A, and they're all grouped together. And you'll notice they're not splitting them out into separate groupings based on if they start at the beginning of the alphabet or the end of the alphabet with the J's. So you're getting Johns and James and Jacksons all mixed together. But in some ways, this can be easier because if you know exactly the first and last name, you can find someone very easily. The downside is that if you don't know a first name of someone you're looking for, it can actually create more time to go through the indexes. And I think that was why the Campbell index was a little bit more disputed, because it does take a little bit more time to actually compile and group everyone together. Another types of records that we find are from COT systems. They are actually still in business today. They were actually first established in 1888 in Columbus, Ohio, and they have developed what they known as modern indexing systems, at least at that time. And they've really started to take that modernity to looking into how to even take the records, the indexes that we're going to show shortly, and also how to take those and move them more online. So that's really the next business venture, is how to do online indexing with the different governments. And they had a number of different indexes that we'll talk about. So one of the more common ones is known as the COT key index. So that's when we actually organize it by surname and then by first name. And there is a guide sheet that you can use at the top under a general index so you can locate the name. So here's that guide sheet that we see at the very top. So we see that these are different names. I have highlighted A and B, so we're going to have the last names there. And then they even tell you based on the given name, so the first name, what that letter is and what page that corresponds to. So in a way, it's kind of taking it from some of the other earlier indexes and just making it a little bit easier to find them. Now, they also have what's known as a universal index. So if we didn't want to just put all the last names and the first names together, you can actually divide them up into separate units or combinations of letters or surnames that you can find. They even group together commonly occurring surnames. So let's say you have a lot of Smiths together. They also have accounted for this by putting them after the different combinations in the different tabs. So their big systems were creating these more standardized indexing books that could actually be purchased by the different clerks and be used over and over. So here's a Cotco Universal Index out of Alamance, North Carolina, and this is showing probates in estate indexes. So for this one, with using the Cotco Universal, you're actually looking for either the names that fall within a particular um, variant of that name. So for example, like we see in column 2, there's Andrews and Andrew. So whether it's singular or plural, they're both going to be on page 97. And then you might find different versions of Baines, Bane, Bane. So it's really accounting for a lot of those names that you find in a Soundex together. But in this case, you're actually looking for the specific surname. So if the surname is not actually listed in the universal index, then that usually means that that surname was not found in the files if they had indexed correctly. So at least it is an easier way of how to go directly to a certain surname. However, sometimes you can find these indexes can be a bit lengthy if they have a lot of names and it's a big county too. And there also is what's known as the Cott Family Name Index. So this is when we actually split out that general index into more specific surname groupings. So if you wanted to look at, the different ones for the B's, you might find that there is ones for BA, and then they might additionally then go into BAR, BAS to BAT, etc. And then again, they group those surnames together that sound alike as well. So here's the Cott Family Name Index, and this is based on federal tax liens out of Greenville County, South Carolina. And what's also interesting is that they also account for putting the names of businesses as well into these indexes. So even if you were trying to search not necessarily an ancestor, but maybe a business, a company, you also can find them in a lot of these indexes, especially with the COT systems, or in the other ones as well, but they might be accounted for separately. So we can see that there are different ranges of different names available. So in the second column, we see that there is BAE, BAF, BAG, BAH, BAI, and BAK. And then those names are then split out by individual surnames with the page numbers. And then it gets to the next grouping as well. Another type of index that you also might come across is what's known as the Russell Key Index. And this is another one you see a lot with a lot of deeds and other types of records, especially in like the Mid-Atlantic and Pennsylvania. And this is really based on actually using very specific letters. So it's looking at the key letters of L, M, N, R, and T that follow the first letter of the surname. So, and sometimes they can, so this can actually, so how you use this is, let's say you had a surname of Chapman. So based on those key letters, you're looking for one of those letters to show up first. So in that case, the key letter is M. So that's going to be how they're going to appear is under the letter M. And then you basically go and look for the first name next. So it's a little more complicated. Now, if you don't have a name with a key letter in them, then they're put under a miscellaneous category. And again, similar to what we saw with Cotco, the corporations are also indexed separately as well. So here's a Russell index key that we see in some Pennsylvania records where you have the LMNRT on the very top, as well as miscellaneous, and then you have your given name initials. So you basically have to use it as kind of like you have to go across. So you basically take the key letter that you're finding in the surname, and then the first letter of the first name, and then that tells you what page number you go to. So these guides are really helpful. It's just that you have to find them within the index, and usually they're within individual sections as they split them up. But in this case, if I wanted to go to, let's say, with the key letter L and with the first name A, I would go to page 11. So here is an example of the page index for the grantors, where we can see here's under the L. So that's the key letter of L is being contained in the name. And these actually are under the surname A that we have here. So, and I'm sorry, I meant to say the given name was a surname here. So we can see that there are all different surnames by A's available, and sometimes they can even be split out into different groupings as well, such as if it's L and then if there's another key letter, they'll keep going on as well. And this is probably one of the more complicated ones that you might come across. Now, I know that was a lot, so let's talk about how we can actually identify what indexing system is being used when you're looking at different types of records. So, as a general rule, when you're looking at a lot of these different records, you want to start with going through the first few pages of a courthouse book. So, whether it is a formal index that's been created using these more modern systems, such as Cott and Russell Key, or they're just handwritten, you generally just want to start with the first few pages because that at least gives you an idea of how that book was set up and if any pages were started to really set up that index that you're going to start going through that. And that will usually give you an idea of maybe if there was any instructions or anything that was noted by who actually compiled that index. And a lot of times you'll find with the more modern indexing records, so let's say late 19th century, you find that you might even get details such as the name of the type of index that was used, the name of the indexing company, where they're located, and they will give you these instructions on how the index system works. So you want to make sure you're taking a look at those first few pages to help you understand an index, especially if you're just not sure about how to find a name in there. So here's an example of the Burr record index that's showing up in an index that we find on Family Search for Talbot County, Maryland. And it explicitly even tells you that this is the Burr's record index. It even tells you what types of companies are using this, such as banks and insurance companies. It notes that this is being used for deeds, court records, tax lists, vital records, probate, etc. And then it goes over the instructions on how you use it. And you'll also find when you keep going down the name of it, it also will even tell you who actually manufactured the company. So if you're curious about where this might have started, there also is information on when they started patenting some of these different volumes here. And it even gives you some helpful tips letting you know that this is not a vowel index. All names are indexed by the first two letters. So it helps you just to understand that there is something different because when we see things like the vowel index being used, that was more common when a lot of the records were first started to be used, but then when they started getting more sophisticated, it was really being phased out for these other types of indexes that we say. And you also can find the type of index being used on Family Search and other places where you find the catalogs for the records. So in this case, if we're looking at land records for Dorchester County, Maryland, it even notes here, it talks about those grantor and grantee indexes. And it notes here that they are in separate volumes and also that there are general indexes as well that they actually are using a vowel index. So sometimes you might find that it's going to be, you're going to see a couple versions of it. So you might start with a grantor grantee index. You have to get familiar with that. And then note that they're going to use a vowel index on how they use that to get to the respective volume. There are some great resources that are out there, and these are also in your handout. I definitely recommend reading Christine Rose's Courthouse Indexes Illustrated. In addition to, I'm giving my own example, she gives her own examples as well of these indexes, as well as a few others we didn't talk about. There is also the Family Search Wiki, which is very detailed and gives a lot of these examples I used here to show you the different types of indexing systems specifically being used in the United States. And Kimberly Powell even has an article in the NGS magazine on how you can use these courthouse indexes as well, which is very helpful. Now, we're not done yet. We're going to talk about some tips on how you can find your ancestor in the indexes and some popular indexes that you might come across. First thing to note here is we need to keep in mind about spelling. So as you can see, while we have Soundex, we need to keep in mind of how a name sounds. Because spelling was not standardized before 1850, names are just often going to be recorded based on what the clerks heard. Especially if the person was not literate enough to spell it out, they're just going to put down what they heard. So think about that, especially if someone might have maybe a heavier accent, that can have an impact on how the records might be written. So you need to account for all spelling variants when you're searching for surnames. Because until you get into some of the more modern indexes, it doesn't always account for every single version. So you might need to think of a list when you're looking at a surname and write out what you think those surnames could have been if you try to say it out loud a few times, how it might have been spelled. And some tips when locating women. They can be indexed under many different names. If their maiden name is known, they may be indexed under that name. They also can be indexed under their married names, especially if their maiden name is not known or just based on when that record was taken, when they were in maybe a record with their husband, for example. And keeping in mind that as multiple marriages may occur, that can have an impact on when someone can be indexed. So in the example of Alice, let's say she has married twice. So Alice was Alice Freeman, but then she was also Alice Thompson and Alice Park, and it accounts for the different variants that you might see here. So keep that in mind that when you're looking for women in these individual indexes, you may need to keep in mind if there were separate marriages that need to be tracked as well. And another tip I want to give too is that unfortunately, not all records include women in the index. A lot of times, especially when you're dealing with things like property, they're going to be under either their father's name or their husband's name in conjunction with records that are about them. So in that case, you actually need to search for another family member to look for that. Another tip I have, which I didn't include here, is that if you search certain databases, such as the Massachusetts Vital Records database on American ancestors, if you put in the maiden name of the person plus their first name, that actually will help pick up remarriages and also death records as well. So sometimes you can be really creative with doing searches and count for trying to search for many different versions of their names. And with deed indexes, when we say that women are not really showing up in the indexes, for example, they're not being named explicitly in that index. So if a spouse is selling land and it's in the husband's name, oftentimes you find that they may list it as, let's say, Andrews, comma John, and then it might say something like et ux, which is Latin for and wife. When you go to the actual deed, it will include the wife's first name. You may not necessarily get the maiden name out of it unless there's a direct relationship in the deed, but at least you'll get their first name, which can help to make sure you're looking at very common names of people as differentiating with the spouse. You also may find something like et al. And others, which also could include additional family members or business associates. So here's an example of a deed index that is showing a David Ferguson et ux in Jefferson County, Mississippi. So you see that it will just be listed directly next to in the grantor column. And the reason why is that women had to give up their dower right to property, and that's why they would be included. So then when we go to the respective record, we see that David Ferguson of Adams County, Mississippi, and we learn his wife's name is Jane. So that's how we get that detail. When you're looking for enslaved persons, whether they be Native Americans or African Americans, or other enslaved persons you're looking for, you want to make sure that you're accounting for different headings that someone might appear. And the reason why is that in a lot of cases, someone did not have a surname that was given to them or been adopted later. So in a lot of times you'll find, especially when you get into like earlier records, that you might find that there is no last name. So when we look in things like different indexes like vital records and other categories, you may find that there is a separate heading like unknown surname. They could be listed under Negroes or enslaved persons or slaves. And these headings can sometimes be at the very end of an index, even in things like church records as well. So for example, you might find that there is a list of unknown surnames, and then you might find the list of enslaved, such as Cato, Mary, and Pompey are listed, and then there might be their page numbers respectively, so you can look at that record. So in this example from American Ancestors, we have an alphabetical index of births, marriage, and deaths for Providence, Rhode Island. And sometimes you might find that there are examples where there is a last name noted of Negro. Now, in this case, this is actually a record from the 1930s. So in this case, sometimes they might classify race in there as well. So keep that in mind when you're also doing a search, is that you may come across that as well, where they're not necessarily enslaved, but they're noting their race as well when you're trying to search for people. So we're going to wrap up with some popular genealogy indexes before we take questions. So a popular index that you might come across is known as the American Genealogical Biographical Index. It's known as AGB for short. It's hosted by the Godfrey Memorial Library, and they have an online website where you can actually request references to records that we find in AGB, but I'm going to show you some tips on how you can use this index. So with this American Genealogical Biographical Index, it's largely going to include things like county histories, genealogies, basically anything that's been written up about different people that of note. And sometimes it could be things like military histories. So it is a place where you could go and search to see if maybe your ancestor appears in some type of published record where you could find them. So you could do a search by their first and last name. Maybe you have some details on their birth year or location. Or if you even head down to specific keywords that you're trying to search on as well. So let's say I did an example for Nathaniel Carr, and I'm looking for him, and I have found an entry of someone born between 1740 and 1749 in Virginia. He's appearing in a military occupation, and you want to pay very close attention to the reference at the bottom here. So it's telling you that actually Nathaniel Carr is appearing in a book called Historical Register of Virginians in the Revolution, Soldiers, Sailors, and Marines, and it gives you the author's information, the publishing details, etc., and even down to a page number, page 132. So those are all going to be really key information to note on how to actually find it. So don't think that this is the end of the record. There is a way to find out more about this person and actually find that reference. So when you're on like sites like Ancestry, you may want to do a keyword search in the card catalog. You can access the card catalog by going up to search, card catalog, and I usually like to do a keyword search. So I start to put in the name of that title there. And you'll notice that it was abbreviated, register, it was REG, but I knew that that's what it likely stood for. So you could start to put in some of those keywords in there. And in this case, there actually was a book that is available through the card catalog for the Historical Register of Virginians in the Revolution. So I can then go into that, and this is an online book that has been added to Ancestry. And there actually is a separate database that you can actually go ahead and now do a search on Nathaniel Carr to find out what you want to know about in the book. And this can be very helpful, especially if the page number was not noted in the reference. So in this case, I did a search on Nathaniel Carr. There was only one entry that came up in the search results. It was on page 132, as we expected. And then we can then click on that image to see what was actually written up about Nathaniel Carr. And here we see that Nathaniel Carr was based out of the Amherst militia, and it's noting of E might be a company number or something like that. So that gives you a reference of where you can actually find him as a register. So that might give you some details maybe about the area where he is serving in. So you may want to look at those serving in the Amherst militia. Was that close to where he was living? Now, you also can go on the Godfrey Memorial Library website, and they have an AGB search request form. It is a paid service, but if you have a citation that maybe is just very hard to decipher, and you don't have a copy of the physical AGB books, for example, you may want to just submit a request for the citation where you basically give the details from Ancestry, pay your $15, and then they will give you a copy. Now, another popular index you might come across is what's known as Philby's Passenger and Immigration Lists Index. This is including approximately 4.7 million persons that arrived in the United States and Canadian ports between the 1500s and 1900s. So anytime there is some type of published source, and this could be a county history, it could be a genealogy, it could be even a newsletter for an historical society, it could be a journal article. It really is anything that has been published that has been picked up in these books could appear in there. So this could be a good way to look into doing some of that immigration search. So you can actually find Philby's index on Ancestry, Family Search. There's even books available through the Internet Archive, and your local libraries might even have the physical books as well. So the details are going to give you information on their name and age, where and when they arrived in the United States or Canada ports, what record was it showing, that naturalization or immigration record? So was there actually a naturalization passenger list, a naturalization petition? Was there a diary entry? Was there something that just corroborates that they actually came over from somewhere else? And gives you some details about what the source is and if there's any accompanying family members with the age and relationship, because that is always a key way of looking at, do you have the right person based on who else might have been accompanying them. And at the beginning of the books, you'll find a key to sources index. So there is what's known as a source number that's associated, and then you get a list of the different sources. And these are going to show you based on the different authors and the names of titles. So again, you could have naturalization records, you could have lots of different histories, etc. So it is quite vast. So you can actually search this on Ancestry. So let's say I wanted to put in a name, and let's say I wanted to look up my great-grandfather, Thomas Corcoran. And I knew his birth year was about 1880, and he came over from Ireland. And he settled in New York City. So you usually don't want to put in a birth location. You want to start with where did they actually settle and arrive in. So here I get lots of different entries for Thomas Corcoran, showing different arrival years. Some of them do not have a birth year, so that might involve a little more research to see if you have the right person. But that can help you at least narrow down, is there someone that might fit your criteria based on when they approximately arrive, using things like the census and locations that they might have settled in. So if I looked at one of these entries, I see that there was a Thomas Corcoran that had arrived in New York. I see that the source bibliography that's corresponding to this is based on tombstones of Irish in the Cemetery of Holy Cross in Brooklyn, and it is a published book. Now, since that book is a little more recent, 1994, it's likely not going to be digitized online, but you can find it in your local library. So I like to use a site called WorldCat, which is basically a global database of different libraries connected together, where you can actually search across libraries to find different materials that you can either check out your local library or have interlibrary loaned to you. So let's say I did a search on tombstones of the Irish born. And here I actually come up with the book right away. So Tombstones of the Irish Born, Cemetery of the Holy Cross, and Flatbush, Brooklyn. So I see that there is a print book and who actually publishes it. And then I want to go into the catalog entry to find out where I can get a copy of it. So in this case, I had my location defaulted to Alliance, Ohio. So obviously you can change that based on your location. And what it'll do is it'll actually tell you where the nearest libraries are to you. There'll be a list of featured libraries and also all libraries. I like to recommend you use the All Libraries tab, just to make sure that you're accounting for all specific ones. The featured are almost like, I think, like special partners that are being used, or maybe more specific ones that they think will have it. But sometimes I could find things at my local library that may be a lot easier to use, and I use this to help a lot of patrons. So in this case, I went to the All Libraries tab, and I could even check off just public libraries, because sometimes you might find that it's a university library or it's a non-circulating library. So that could be a way to filter down to results where you can actually get a copy of the book. Now, there are other different popular indexes out there that you're going to come across in your genealogy, and they're going to include things like Torrey's New England Marriages 1700, which is on our website, American Ancestors. So if you're looking for those earlier marriages, you can actually do a search on that. There's also what's known as the Periodical Source Index, PERSI, which is hosted by the Allen County Public Library. So any different periodicals that are out there and journals and things you might come across, you might be able to come across all kinds of really interesting articles and histories that were done. You have different indexes around the Social Security, which include the Death Index and the Applications and Claims Index. I particularly really love the Applications and Claims Index because if you have someone that's died after that 1936 date, there could be a good chance that parents' names were reported on that record. So that can really fill in some details on some more recent family. And then if you're looking for military veterans, between 1850 and 2010, you can actually find the Burrell's death file, which can tell you information on when they actually were deceased, and you can get information sometimes about enlistment dates as well. So in review, something to keep in mind that is the indexes that you're using in a lot of the different records that we showed, they were created for the staff that were working at the courthouses and not necessarily for genealogists so that they could retrieve the records more easily. But by understanding how each of these index is constructed, it will make it a lot easier to find your ancestors and know that you've searched the correct pages within a volume to make sure that you've done an exhaustive search. Keeping in mind that sometimes not all of the indexes available are not going to be online, and sometimes you may need to request a lookup or actually go to the repository to look at those records. Account for any spelling variants and exhaust those in your searches. And remember, even if you don't find something in the index, that doesn't mean the record doesn't exist. Indexers are human too, and sometimes that record could have just been missed when it was created. So sometimes you might have to look at other alternatives to find that record. Thank you, and I'll go ahead and pass to Maggie for some questions.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Before we turn to your questions, I just want to highlight a few of our upcoming events. We have a free online lecture coming up about using voting records in family history research on August 1st. This is another lecture that will be presented by Melanie. And then starting next month, we have an online research course, Louisiana Family History Research, 4 Centuries of History and Genealogy. Join us on Wednesdays throughout the month for in-depth lectures, Q&A with instructors, and more. Then in the middle of August, on the 15th, we will be offering another webinar, Setting Yourself Up for Success, Organizational Tools and Tips to Break Down Brick Walls. This lecture will be presented by Rhonda McClure. You can learn more about these and all of our upcoming events at americanancestors.org/events. All right, let's turn to your questions. Go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A panel, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time provided. Melanie, one question that we got was, does Ancestry, Family Search, and others have all of the Philby editions online? Are these being created every year?
So my understanding is that the Ancestry Philby's index, I think, is done up to 2010, And there are some links in the handout. I want to say that Ancestry has a more complete set than what's available online for free through Family Search. I think Family Search goes out to a certain number of volumes and then they might still be on microfilm. But yeah, so keep it in mind. I'm not sure if they're being regularly still updated since 2010. I'd have to look into that, but feel free to drop me a note if you are looking for something specific.
All right, thank you. We have another question about indexes for naturalization cards.
Sure.
What do the numbers refer to, and where can people access the documents that are being referred to?
Sure. Are they asking about the document that the numbers that was actually noted on the index cards, I believe?
I believe it was the notation on the cards.
Yeah, so it depends on the different type of naturalization index card. Usually that's referring to like a docket number or a case file number that corresponds to that individual court. Sometimes you'll find that with the later ones, you're going to get more of the maybe the petition number. Since that one was like a 1796 record, it might be more of a different file number that was noted. So it really just depends on which record it is, because I found that some of the naturalization index cards can include different details on there when you're using those alphabetical indexes. So it's really going to vary location to location in terms of how they're recording those records.
All right, and we have a couple questions about after you look through an index, find what you're looking for, where do you go to find the files that are listed as numbers in the index?
Yes, so with each of these different indexes, they're going to list the volume or book number and the page numbers. So that's how you know where to look for it. And then what you want to do is you want to go into that catalog, knowing that a lot of these are probably going to be on sites like Family Search, and look for that respective volume. Now, keep in mind that sometimes not all the volumes are available online, so you might need to reach out to the repository noted in the description to get a copy of it, which might be still at an active courthouse.
All right. Thank you so much for all of your answers. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, and I want to thank everyone for all of your thoughtful questions. If you have more specific questions about your family history research, you may consider working with one of our genealogists. To work one-on-one with a genealogist, we offer consultations to start working on a specific question or get assistance with your family history. You can reach out to get this process started by emailing consultations@nehgs.org. There will also be a QR code on the next slide that you can use to sign up directly. If you have a larger scale question about your family history research, you may consider working with our research services team, who conduct research for hire. You can learn more by contacting research@nehgs.org. And here's the QR code that you can use to sign up directly for a consultation. Thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have an opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.